It's difficult to compare the brain to any of our technologies, not just plastic, but even now, even digital computers and LLMs. It's very difficult to say, oh yeah, this is the tech that it equals, because it's so much more complex than any of that.
Hello and welcome to Neural Compass. I'm Mark Jacobstein. I am really honored today to be speaking with Dr. David Eagleman, who is a real polymath. So I'm going to look at my notes here because there are too many things to list to have memorized all this. Dr. Eagleman is a prominent neuroscientist here at Stanford, but really one of the preeminent communicators around the brain and brain science alive. So he does research in everything from neuroplasticity to sensory substitution, time perception, law, almost anything really that interacts with the brain. And we're going to get into the breadth of the things that he covers here. He's the bestselling authors of some, Incognito, The Brain, the story, which is the story of you. Wednesday is Indigo Blue, which is one of my favorite titles for a science-oriented book ever. And most recently, Livewired, which I was going to bring today to get autographed, but forgot. He also created the Emmy-nominated The Brain for PBS and BBC, and has been called the Carl Sagan of neuroscience. We're really honored to have you here today. One of the things I really enjoyed about your work is the breadth. It reminds me a little bit of a Noah Feldman or a Yuval Harari, one of these people who will talk about anything through the lens of the thing that they know, which for you is the brain. The first thing I wanted to get into today was neuroplasticity. One of the, I think, things that you've studied the most and talked about the most, and the most recent book was really about, was the concept of neuroplasticity. So why don't we start with sort of of course, your book was called Livewired, and I think there's an interesting reason for that as well, as opposed to calling it neuroplasticity. So why don't we talk about the concept and why it's something that you're so fascinated with?
Great. Okay. Well, first of all, pleasure to be here with you, Mark. The idea is that your brain is constantly reconfiguring. You've got almost 100 billion specialized cells called neurons, and these connect to each other in a very detailed way. But that's not a static map. They're always unplugging and replugging and changing their strength and seeking. And this is actually something that's very weird, is to think about what's going on inside your head. It's like you have 100 billion little creatures that are all moving and slithering around every moment of your life. But this is the point, is that every moment of your life, this is happening. So it never stops. You're always on your way to becoming something. Your brain is never sort of, set in place. Okay. So traditionally this is called brain plasticity. The reason I don't love that term is because William James introduced that term. William James, of course, being a genius, hard to compare him to anybody, but he was impressed 100 years ago with plastic manufacturing, where you have a material that you can mold into a shape and it'll hold on to that shape. That's what we like about plastic. But now that we understand the size of what is happening and the speed at which it's happening, every nanosecond of your life, things are moving and changing. It seems to me like plastic is an outdated metaphor.
Plastic isn't that plastic is sort of the point. Actually, it's not actually that malleable.
That's exactly right. Because what we find useful about a toy or a bowl or a headphones is that we, you shape it once and it holds on to that forever. But that's something is a little bit different going on in the brain. It's difficult to compare the brain to any of our technologies, not just plastic, but even now, even digital computers and LLMs. It's very difficult to say, oh yeah, this is the tech that it equals, because it's so much more complex than any of that. Okay, so I use the term Livewired, which is a way of distinguishing. In Silicon Valley, obviously, everything we do is hardware and software, but liveware is something that's this other thing where it's constantly reconfiguring its own circuitry. We don't build things like that. The key is that the brain does build, this is all the brain does, is change its own circuitry based on its experience. Just as an example, there are all these clinical cases, like, I don't think I put this in the book, but one of my favorite cases is a guy who went into the doctor's office and he said he was having leg pain. So the doctor tested him, couldn't figure out what it was. He said, why don't we get a brain scan just to be sure? Turns out this guy had what's called hydrocephalus, where you get a buildup of fluid pressure inside your brain. As a result, the space inside your brain, what's called the ventricle, had gotten filled up with fluid, and his brain had become squished against the sides of his skull. So his brain was very thin. If you look at a scan of his brain, it looks like mostly blank black space. and the rest is, the brain part is just squished up against the skull. But the point is, he had a job, he was married, he had a normal IQ, everything was fine about this guy. We just don't know how to build stuff like that. You and I have both been in tech our whole lives, and it's just not how we build things with that kind of flexibility. So that's what brain plasticity is about.
We'll push on that a little bit, because I would have, until two or 3 years ago, I would have agreed completely with that assessment. Interestingly, I do think that there are a lot of analogs, and I think we'll have a longer conversation about sort of parallels between AI and the brain. But I think there are some analogs with LLMs where we can shrink large language models down to small language models and still see high performance, where we can do things like pruning, et cetera, that are analogous to a brain being pushed against the side of a skull, or to somebody losing half a hemisphere, and see small pieces of sort of fall off in performance, but not nearly as much as you might think, which anyways, I think is interesting. But
let me just address that. Yeah, which is, it's absolutely right that our technology is moving in the direction of the brain, and obviously artificial neural networks are predicated on neural networks. So, so we've been looking at the biology for a long time, saying, how could we build something that's similar to this? Even still, you can't go to a data center and run your truck over half the racks of servers and hope it'll still work. But a child with, let's say, an intractable epilepsy in one half of their brain can get half their brain removed, what's called a hemispherectomy, and they're just fine. So there's still something different about the way we're building.
No, there is, and it's fascinating what I guess Nassim Taleb would have called anti-fragile about the brain, and ability to, and we'll get into this too, I think related to these notions of plasticity or livewiredness, the ability to adapt to the sort of obvious dramatic things like I'm missing half a hemisphere, but also, I think in one of your books, you cite an example, like Einstein plays a lot of violin. He ends up with like a sort of walnut-sized growth in his brain that is related to sort of the dexterity of the fingers that are involved with manipulating a violin, et cetera.
Right. So it turns out violinists, the cortex, the outer 3 millimeters of the brain is wrinkly. Most people have seen that kind of picture. It turns out it can get more wrinkly. And so if you're a violinist, what you get is on your right hemisphere, you get a bigger wrinkle. In other words, there's more, you get an extra fold. It's called the omega sign because it looks like the Greek letter omega. Anyway, violinists have that because their left fingers have to do so much detailed work. As it turns out, piano players get that extra fold on both of their hemispheres because both their hands are doing lots of extra work with their fingers. So what you do gets reflected in what your brain physically looks like.
Literally in the physical manifestations. And again, it reminds me a little bit of how we're trying to unpack now what's happening inside LLMs and looking at the layers, et cetera. So I think that the notion of plasticity and ability of ourselves to sort of constantly rewire our brain, I think is fascinating on many different levels. One of the areas, of course, we're particularly interested in at Jimini is thinking about mental health. And I was struck. I was listening to a podcast that you were doing recently with the CEO, co-founder of a company called AMPA, which is a company that is making transcranial stim to address things like depression and serious mental illness. And it occurred to me that actually in the mental health field, there are many, many different ways that people are trying to address the notions of neuroplasticity, basically to induce greater neuroplasticity, to allow people to pop themselves out of sort of bad cognitive patterns. And this is true in the way we think about therapy. It is true in the way people are thinking about therapeutics, like many of the neuroplastogens that are being developed. And it is also true when we think about transcranial stim and other ways that we are sort of literally inducing change in the physical structures of the brain, all in the interest of combating mental illness. I'm curious if that's an area you sort of poked at, looked at, and sort of thoughts on the role of neuroplasticity in sort of mental health.
Yeah. Every approach to mental health, as you point out, is an approach to plasticity. It's just different ways of going about it. So, for example, we're extremely social creatures. And so every time you talk to somebody else, there are changes in your brain as a result of that. When a person who's suffering with any sort of mental illness goes to a therapist and talks with them, it's all about the plastic change. The therapist is trying to point out, hey, think about it this way. What if you reframe that way? And so on. That's all about plastic changes. The idea with something like transcranial magnetic stimulation is just another version of doing that. In this case, what you're doing is you're essentially stimulating plasticity in particular areas like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And you're giving somebody, in a sense, this is the way I think about it, you're giving someone a second bite at the apple to say, okay, look, somehow this wired up not quite right, so that you're having these looping ruminations that aren't doing you much good. You're having depression as a result of this. So let's just sort of loosen up this area of the tissue and then let the brain do its thing and figure out how to rewire it. And often that works. And what's interesting is that sometimes it doesn't work, and you do it again and you get another shot at it, and oh, now it worked this time.
Yeah, no, I think an apt metaphor maybe is it's almost like stretching and exercising. It maybe sometimes it takes a little bit of time, but you're building a new muscle in effect. It is an interesting framing, I think, for a lot of serious mental illness to think about sort of bad loops. So rumination that is the cause of certain types of anxiety and or depression, and sort of bleeds over into other more serious mental illness. And anything we can do to sort of induce new patterns, healthy patterns, et cetera, seems to be an important part of that therapeutic journey. So when you're doing cognitive behavioral therapy, you're helping somebody reframe something, and that is in effect exercising their ability to sort of get out of the bad rumination, versus some of the neuroplastogens that are being developed as therapeutics, esketamine, et cetera, are basically a chemical way to induce sort of a similar behavior.
Yeah, that's right. And they're less specific, of course. So when you're doing, let's say, cognitive behavioral therapy, you're saying to somebody, hey, look, when this thing comes into your mind, I want you to go down this other pathway. I want you to think about this other thing to pull yourself out of that. Get yourself, some people use the analogy of when you're driving, if you're looking in the rearview mirror, let's say it's some traumatic event that happened, what can you do to get your eyes back on the road ahead of you? So that's a specific way of training. That's what CBT is about. Whereas, ketamine or transcranial magnetic stimulation, these are more general ways of saying, look, we're just going to loosen up the whole system here, and then let's hope that it wires up better when it comes back into play.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm going to go back to this Einstein example, and I love the fact that for all his genius in physics, the thing we can notice about his brain actually when we look at it when we sort of take it out, it is that he was a violin player. The idea that sort of the repetition is also is super important here, and that neurons that fire together wire together, and that the repeated behavior is basically, so you're carving a channel that allows you to do something more easily, more effectively. In mental health, that might be to have a positive, well-framed thought, for example. But it's, whether that's you're trying to hit a pickleball or you're trying to play the piano, this is sort of something we do in all facets of our life. One of the things I'm also struck by in your work is the breadth of the places that you find examples from. So tell me a little bit about your process. I know at this point you're spending more time as a communicator of science than you are, say, running a lab. But for a long time, you ran a lab, you did a lot of research. Tell me about the journey and how and why you've ended up where you are, as I think sort of with this huge focus on science communication.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting, I don't actually know what my distribution of time is right now because I'm running companies and I've been doing that for the last 10 years. I don't have much extra time, but in the extra time that I have, I do a lot of science communication. I grew up watching PBS. Back in my day, it was one of just a few channels, and specifically watching Carl Sagan. And I was so inspired by him. And I thought that was where I had my eyes set, not on being president of the United States or something like that. It was to be the next Carl Sagan. So I loved science. I got into science, but I've always cared a lot about the dissemination. This is for many reasons. First of all, the public funds science. And so you have to let the taxpayers know what's going on. But much more than that, it's the raw beauty of it. I think it's possibly the most beautiful thing that we have on our planet that our species has developed. And it is a development. It's not a discovery. It's a development to learn as a species, as a society, how to think scientifically, which means not getting attached to any particular idea, seeing where the weight of evidence points us, being willing to say, hey, you know what? I was totally wrong about that. And now there's what appears to be a more fruitful avenue to go down here. And, and by the way, everything is provisional, and I'm always willing to change my mind about anything. That's a particular mindset that's taken a long time to develop, and it's really just been in the last few centuries.
We call that a growth mindset now, yes. But
yeah, that's right. That's right. It's really been in the last few centuries that humans have even gotten there, and the progress has been extraordinary. I mean, I don't know if, let's imagine we're about the same age. I'm possibly a little older than you are, but the change we've seen in our lifetime. I mean, when I got a personal computer, I saved up and got a VIC-20, a Commodore VIC-20. That was something that my parents had never had, my grandparents had never had. No one in the history of humankind had a computer where you could make it do all these things. Then we got to see the invention of the internet and then the World Wide Web and all the stuff that happened there. And now we're getting to watch AI, and it's such an extraordinary pace of change that we're living in, and it's only getting steeper. With each one of these developments, it just it cranks up the slope even more. So anyway, this is
for better and for worse. We could probably go down a whole nother conversation about the cognitive and neural and cognitive load of living in a world that is moving as fast as we. I feel like there's very little in our evolutionary history that really prepared us. I understand humans are extremely adaptable, but what we're living through right now feels like almost too much for a lot of people.
That's interesting.
I think a particular challenge, pet theory on one of the reasons why so many people struggle with anxiety, depression, et cetera, in the modern world is a variety of the reasons. Too much time on screens, not enough time IRL, but also the pace of change and inability maybe to keep up. I want to switch gears here, though. You mentioned some of the companies that you've worked on, and my understanding, some of them are in sort of in the sensory substitution space. Fascinating to me, and I've worked with the artificial retina business. I think there's a lot of very cool things happening in this space. Well, talk about sensory substitution and some of your work there, and then maybe we can talk about both the research and some of the startups you've worked on there.
Yeah, sensory substitution is just this idea of pushing information into the brain via unusual sensory channels. So, for example, I developed a vest, and then we later shrunk that down to a wristband that has vibratory motors on it, and we can translate things into patterns of vibration. So, for example, for people who are deaf, we translate sound into patterns of vibration, and that happens to be what your inner ear is doing. It's just capturing vibrations on the eardrum and translating that, breaking down to frequencies, and then shooting that off to the brain and saying, hey, there's this much of this frequency and that much of that frequency, and so on. We're just doing the same thing via vibration on the skin that climbs up to the brain, and deaf people can learn how to hear that way. So I launched that company 11 years ago, just sold it. We got to see a lot of action there. We got to help, many thousands of deaf people around the planet who are wearing this on their wrists now. So that's an example of sensory substitution.
I think one of the things that's interesting for me, I know sensory substitution in sort of its most literal sense, as you describe it, is like receiving sensory input through an organ by which you're not used to receiving it. I would argue that even something like a cochlear implant is actually, it's sort of a sensory substitution. You're still ultimately getting the input that you would have from, say, a healthy inner ear into the same brain circuits maybe that you would have otherwise, but you have replaced the sort of faulty inner ear in the same way that artificial retinas are trying to do this for the blind. It's a very interesting, I think, enriched field sort of with BCI right now. I want to go back to, in reading about the work that you're doing with skin, I was struck by the fact that our ability to feel is underutilized. Like that we there's a lot of there's a lot
our
of
use
input.
of our skin.
Our use of our skin specifically is essentially an underutilized organ. We're using it when we're playing the violin, or we're using it all day long, but that there is more. There's more channel available for input than we typically are using, maybe not when we're playing the violin, but most of the time. And that what you've done is try to repurpose it for a variety of different uses.
Exactly. The skin is the largest organ of the body. And in modern day, we're wearing clothing and we keep it covered up and we don't really do much of anything with it. So the comedian Stephen Wright had a joke from a long time ago where he said, the waist isn't called the waist for nothing. We don't really do anything with this part of the body. And so anyway, I've been very interested in how we can take advantage of that and pass information in that way.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting field, and as somebody who helps to build a lot of startups, one of the richest areas we're seeing is in HCI, BCI. I think there's so much to be done there, and especially actually non-invasively, minimally invasively. People are very excited about Neuralink, et cetera. Super cool. Not that many people are going to actually open up their skulls just yet, unless there's a really serious medical issue that's being addressed. You've spent some time in your career at the intersection of neuroscience and the legal field. And you tell the story of the very famous sniper who, I think one of the first mass shootings really in U.S. history, who had gone up to the top of the tower at the University of Texas and killed quite a few people, and had been sort of a happy and healthy person fairly recently until they sort of lost it. And I think it left behind a fairly dramatic note. And my understanding is that the autopsy revealed that there was, I don't remember if it was a glioblastoma or something happening inside the brain. And you use this as a jumping off point for, I think, a really interesting conversation about what's going on with the brain and how we think about our legal system. And you want to expand on that?
Yeah, the short version is, so that was Charles Whitman, who had, by the way, kept a diary for a year before the mass shooting. It was the first mass shooting in the United States. He had kept a diary for a year where he said, look, something is changing inside of me. And he had gone to a psychiatrist, but this was 1966, and there was no brain scanning, but there was nothing a psychiatrist could do. And so he just kept, getting plagued by these thoughts of anger and this uncontrollable feeling inside of him. Anyway, he eventually climbed the tower and murdered all these innocent people. And he was shot to death at the scene. Everyone tried to figure out, who is this guy? What's going on with him? It turns out he had killed his wife and his mother the night before. But they found his diary. They found the suicide note that he typed up on his typewriter, in which he said, something inside me has been changing. When this is all over, I want my brain to be autopsied. And he said, donate whatever money I have left over to a mental health foundation. Maybe research can prevent further tragedies of this type, quote. So, it's always difficult when we find that somebody's committed a crime and then we discover they had a brain tumor. It's difficult to know, was the brain tumor the cause or was it just incidental? You have to look at all the elements of the case. But what his story illustrates is that you are your brain, and when your brain changes, you change. Of course, we know that because people take drugs and alcohol. They're putting various invisible molecules inside their system, and that changes how they behave and how they perceive and so on. And of course, we see this all the time when people get brain tumors or degenerative disorders or anything, and their behavior, who they are, changes. And that's how we know that you are your brain. So yes, I've been very interested in what this all means for the legal field. I'm still running the Center for Science and Law. After 15 years, we're still cranking along. Essentially, what it has to do with is how can we import a better biological understanding into our legal system so that it's not simply that we treat incarceration as a one-size-fits-all solution, but instead we say, okay, look, what do we do from here? If somebody's committed a crime, they need to be taken off the street. But are there smarter things we can do instead of just incarcerating everybody? Can we have rehabilitative pathways that we're putting people down depending on what's going on with them? And the answer is, of course we can. I mean, take something like drug addiction. There are many, many strategies from pharmaceutical to circuit interventions that we can do instead of saying, oh, we're going to put you in jail and hope that that's going to take care of your craving, because it won't. What we've been doing with the war on drugs for decades is attacking drug supply instead of addressing drug demand. So, it's things like this.
That's fascinating when you think about culpability. Particularly in a dramatic case like that, where you literally have a glioblastoma. I think it was sort of up against the amygdala, and somebody who is chronicling their own sort of descent into madness before committing a heinous crime like that. I suspect also a lot of interesting things to be done in terms of even the brain and bias as well. And the way there's stories like you don't want to have the judge at 3:00 in the afternoon when they're cranky. You want them at 10 a.m. and, all the rest of it. And more in the sort of thinking fast and slow world.
But it's actually the opposite, which is before they've had lunch, they actually give tougher.
At 11 a.m. 11 a.m. is the worst.
Okay, versus after lunch when they're satisfied. Yeah, that's true. And by the way, I'm like everybody, very interested in AI, and I'm curious what the future is going to be in terms of incorporating AI into the legal system, in terms of saying, look, what are the statistics of recidivism in a case like this? I'm going to do pattern extraction over millions of previous cases and modulate the sentencing based on what we think is the probability that this guy is going to commit crime again.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, of course, that specific problem is one of the most challenging alignment problems in AI because even humans can't agree on what actually the right answer is there, because even recidivism can reflect certain types of bias, et cetera. But that's
no, I don't think so. I don't think so. It's really just a statistical question, which is for people in your situation, what's the likelihood that you're going to commit this crime again? And by the way, this can be free of any, I don't know which bias you're referring to, but let's say racial bias, free of any of that.
Well, so so you're right in terms of if we could have a pure statistic in terms of likelihood to commit, which is, I guess the point is that it's different than the likelihood to be recaught or reconvicted. So it's hard to come up with the truly unbiased training set, I guess, to determine to write that algorithm. But yes, I take your point.
And the question is, do we want to stick with a very old, outdated method, which is anyone who's committed this crime gets 5 years in prison, versus at least trying to get closer to something that makes more sense?
Exactly. And one of the challenges, I think, for everybody who's using AI to create social change is that the standards sometimes that they're held to are higher than how good humans are already. Just ask the people with self-driving cars, which are already far safer than human drivers, but we expect them to be essentially error-free before we feel really good about them. Yeah, fascinating. So I switch gears again. You've spent more time over the last decade now as an entrepreneur. Sounds like just had a successful exit. Tell me about areas you're interested in pursuing, given all the things that are happening with AI, LLMs, and also our understanding of the brain. I mean, it's interesting. AI gets all the is sort of suck the oxygen out of the room with the conversation. My sense is that our understanding of what's happening in the brain has also, we've had an explosion. There's been a variety of new techniques that allow us to sort of interrogate more closely precisely what's happening with neural circuitry. Probably some interesting metaphors in terms of what we're learning vis-a-vis neural nets that bleeds over into how we understand the brain. Anyways, I'm curious, like where do you want to push?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you some of the things I'm doing right now. One of the things that I just kicked off a new company that has to do with in-home robotics for elderly people who live alone. So it's a companion robot. And that's cool. But the real innovation that we're doing has to do with what's happening under the hood. So the robot can detect if you've had a stroke. It can detect through time mild cognitive impairment. Obviously, things like if you've fallen, things like that. And so it's like having, a fun companion, which AI is quite good at, but like a doctor in your home with you all the time.
It's like a great home health aid. It can address everything probably from like loneliness, which is a key issue for elderly shut-ins, to more serious things like I'm noticing that the whatever COPD issue is becoming more serious, or they're exhibiting signs of stroke. I love that. There's an interesting company that was probably a decade too soon called Jibo. It was started by Cynthia Brazil, who's a professor at MIT, and same but different. Wanted to address some of these issues. I think it was much, much harder to do a decade or 15 years ago.
Oh, exactly. I mean, the whole thing about having a companion robot that talks with you, we're just plugging into these LLM. I mean, it's trivial, that part of it. And that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago.
Well, the robotics are easier and the hardware is easier, like all of it.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
really exciting.
One of the other things I'm doing has to do with, I'm really interested in why we're so predisposed for in-groups and out-groups and believing our own truths and thinking the other side is a bunch of idiots or stubborn or misinformed or whatever. So I'm very interested in building new social media algorithms that actually combat polarization instead of cause it. So I've actually just patented this. It's an algorithm, just very, in one sentence, it's just, it surfaces things that we would have in common. Oh, you like this kind of dog too. Oh, you like surfing also. So we get to know each other that way. And then if it turns out that you and I have totally opposite points of view on some political hot button issue, we don't learn that until later.
We've
Until
already,
we're already
established
bonded.
rapport.
Exactly. So it's it's a straightforward, simple idea, but nobody's implemented this, and I'm trying to get there's a new social network that's about to come out of stealth, and I'm trying to get them to implement this.
Oh, that's interesting. And is the goal to drive these interactions virtually, or to sort of use it to facilitate these interactions in real life, or a little bit of both, or it's still too early to know?
I mean, it would be great if it leads to real life stuff, and maybe it will. But the general thing that I'm interested in is complexifying relationships so that hey, look, Mark and I have all these things in common. We've got a couple things that are different, and that's interesting. I want to hear what he's got to say about that, as opposed to I'm going to dismiss him because he's in that camp and I'm in the other camp.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think in general, human beings have so much more in common than they do otherwise. I mean, there are, of course, extreme outliers, but that'll be interesting. And I think the big question for you and that company will be, is that what people want, or are they addicted to and love their own do they love the anger and the disagreements in some way that maybe they don't want to admit?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that'll be an empirical one. We'll find out through time. But I do think that there is, that this would actually be the thing that the company would sell itself on is, hi, we are here for the purpose of reducing polarization. Look, Blue Sky came out as a move against Twitter. Yeah, but it's just as it's just as biased on the other side. And so, I don't know. I mean, I would be attracted to a social media network that said, hey, we're doing things algorithmically so that everyone can actually make friends. It can actually be social media.
There's actually sort of two pieces there. There's you and I find out what we share. We're both Warriors fans and whatever, like to surf. Actually, that's not me. I hate to surf. But there's also the surfacing of information that maybe challenges your own beliefs, but that is in fact reasonable, well argued, and might actually get you to reconsider your position. I mean, I remember having this epiphany in college with a guy I went to school with, who I had the longest conversation with him on those heated dorm room debates, and he changed his mind, and he admitted it. And a little kudos to myself for actually having persuaded him. But I thought it was cool that he thought it through, and he'd come to a new realization. And anyways, I think we don't have enough of that either. And to the extent that I don't know that in the attention economy, it's not clear to me that the algorithms, if what they're tuned for is your attention, that bringing you things that challenge you may not actually be what you want. Well, so we'll see.
So I actually just made this argument on my podcast, Inner Cosmos, that AI might actually make humans better in the following way. So you may have heard about this study. It just came to light recently. It's a Swiss research group. They went on this Reddit channel where people will debate points. And what they look for, how you gain points, is if you change somebody's mind. If someone says, hey, you know what? I actually changed my mind based on your very, good argument, then you get points for that. Okay. So it turns out what these researchers did is they released some AI bots into this Reddit room, and these bots engaged in debate on these things, and they absolutely crushed the humans. The average human has like a 3% success rate. These bots had an 18% success rate. Okay. A lot of people got scared about that. They said, oh my God, we're getting manipulated by bots and whatever. But I have a more optimistic view on it, which is the reason these bots won and changed people's minds was not because they were giving misinformation or something like that. It's because they were calm and rational, and they presented the arguments well. And people said, hey, you know what? You've changed my mind on that.
They're better communicators than most people.
Exactly. And I think we can really learn from this in the same way that every chess player now plays against AI, so they can learn.
And they're all far better than they used to be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. The average human chess player is way better than 10 years ago.
And the average poker player now, I mean, this was a fascinating one, because poker was sort of the imperfect information system, but the AIs learned to play poker better than the best poker players. And even a very good poker player now apparently is a much better poker player than the best poker player in the world was 5 or 6 years ago.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly right. And so I think, despite everyone's fear around that, I think that we can get train our students to be much better at debate. So instead of getting emotional and calling the other person names and whatever, they're saying, look, let me present this rationally and calmly and empathetically.
I love that vision. That's really interesting. So, other ideas, or is that enough? We've got at least one or two startups that are going on at any given time, probably working on a new book. You got the podcast.
I'm working on 5 new books.
5 new books. Okay.
Yeah, although I have to confess that I am worried. I've spent my whole life being an author, and I'm worried that books aren't a thing anymore. I'm not sure. I still think there's a book market and people enjoy that, but I don't know in a generation or two whether it's going to exist anymore. So I kind of feel like, a cathedral maker who's born in an era where people aren't building cathedrals anymore. So anyway, be that as it may, I'm going to finish these 5.
I think there's still room for long form, but
I hope that's true. And we'll revisit this in 5 years and see whether that ended up being true. I'm going to finish these next 5 books. It's going to take me 5 years, and then I might stop doing that there. I recently started a production company for film and television that has anything meaningfully to do with science. And so we're developing 12 different projects. One of them is underway. I think this is very cool. We're making a movie, a documentary. And the question is, can AI be funny? And so I got the comedian Craig Ferguson, Late Late Show. We've built a bot, and Craig is going to go around the country with the bot and perform on stages. And the question is, can AI be funny? But it's a Trojan horse to open this bigger question about what is AI going to mean for humans, for creatives, for everything in our lives. This is a way of opening up that question in a way that's hopefully quite appealing. So I'm jazzed about that. So that's one of the big projects.
Yeah, that's an amazing project and a funny project in its own right. But it'll be for the audience to decide: is it funny, haha, or funny? Does this milk smell funny? But I think I think one of the earliest. There's an amazing NPR episode about very early red teamer working on the first versions of ChatGPT, who also had some friends, I think, who were professional comedians, and how close, even 2 years ago, ChatGPT was to being funny. It wasn't quite there. I think we're close, and humor is one of the toughest things. I mean, that is, you want to demonstrate super intelligence to me. There are many ways to do it. One of them is like, I always think of it, it's actually a sign of intelligence in humor. There's plenty of people who are very funny. The people who are funny are almost always reasonably intelligent, and certainly in certain ways, and have to understand how somebody's going to react, understand what you think about me, et cetera. That's a great project.
And I'll tell you this. So one of the typical structures of humor is that you set up an expectation and then you violate it. Okay. The thing is, it has to be violated correctly. And what's fascinating is that even GPT-5 has figured out that you need to violate an expectation, but it does it in a way that doesn't make any sense. So the first guy does X, the second guy does Y, and then the third guy, it does something random, but it's not funny at all. It's simply a violation, but there's no double entendre there. So that's what it hasn't gotten yet.
I both love and hate the notion. They're loaded up with the entire corpus of like Richard Pryor and like all the great stuff that came before. But it's hard to imagine with the pace that we are moving with LLMs, et cetera, that it won't be able to conquer humor also.
That may be true. And by the way, I'm totally as optimistic as you are in terms of, okay, by a week from now, this should all be solved. But humor is a special one because you have to construct a joke backwards. You figure out what the punchline is, and then you construct it and camouflage it so you can't see it going forward. LLMs, of course, work in the forward direction where they're guessing, they're
yes, but
what's next?
Or yes, and we'll see. So this is a sort of a loaded question for somebody who's got 12 projects in production and 5, not to mention 5 books. Things that you are reading, listening to, watching, et cetera, right now that you find super thought-provoking, that are sort of at the intersection of some of the things we talked about today. So neuroscience, understanding the brain, AI, mental health, things that you would recommend.
Well, I was the scientific advisor for the show Westworld, and that's, of course, such a great one. Just as a funny example about that, my colleagues and I have written papers about free will for decades. Do we have free will? Do we not? What's the evidence for it? Okay, no one ever reads our papers. No one cares, right? Except my mother maybe reads my paper. But suddenly there's a show, and you can wrap these same questions in a great narrative.
Yeah.
And suddenly you've got tens of millions of people talking about this question, which is wonderful. So that was very cool.
It was a fun show.
That was a fun show and really important in many ways. I'm now the scientific advisor for a show called Severance on Apple TV, and that's sort of a comedy in a weird dark comedy sort of way.
Dark comedy, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a very interesting one in terms of surfacing questions about memory and what happens if, in some scenario you can pull up memories that all draw on each other, but you can't access these other memories that are separate. So my colleague and I are actually building an artificial neural network to demonstrate how that could work and why. So those are
a couple good choices. So you need HBO or Apple TV, and fantastic. Well, thank you so much for the time today. This was super fun. I love the project. I love meeting somebody who has even more projects going on in their life than I do, and pulled in even more directions. But as a committed generalist, I think it's I applaud you and the entrepreneurial spirit and all the rest of it. This has been a lot of fun.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you.